In the summer of 1894, on a stretch of coastline in northwestern Greenland where the sea ice breaks apart for only a few weeks a year, a party of visiting sailors traded for a knife. It was not a remarkable transaction. Crews passing through those waters traded constantly, for meat, for dogs, for clothing, for anything that made the next month survivable. What was remarkable was the knife. The handle was bone, worn smooth by long use. The blade was metal. Not soft, not decorative, not a fragment salvaged from a wreck and lashed into place. It was hammered, cold-worked, sharpened along one edge, and set into the bone with the confidence of a tool that had been made rather than assembled. Someone asked where the metal came from. The answer was not a trading post, or a ship, or a whaling station further south. It was a place, a specific location on that coastline, named plainly, the way a person names a hill they have walked past their entire life. There is no iron ore on that coast, no smelting tradition anywhere in the region, no furnaces, no slag, no charcoal beds, no evidence that anyone there had ever separated metal from rock. The nearest known deposit that could have supplied it lies thousands of miles away, across water frozen solid for most of the year. And yet the knife existed, so did dozens of others like it. So where does a people with no ore and no furnaces get iron? Why had European visitors been recording these tools for the better part of a century without ever locating the source? Why, when the answer was given freely and repeatedly, could no outsider reach the place it pointed to? And why does what was eventually found there raise more questions today than it settled at the time? To understand why that matters, we have to start with what outsiders expected and what the arithmetic of the situation actually said. The people living along that coast are the Inughuit, sometimes called the polar Inuit, the northernmost permanently settled human population on Earth. For long stretches of their history they lived in near total isolation, cut off from other Inuit groups by glaciers and unbroken ice, in an environment offering no timber, no workable clay in useful quantity, and no metal ore of any kind. It is worth being specific about what that means, because the word isolation does a great deal of quiet work in accounts like this one. Everything used there had to come from an animal, from stone, or from the sea. Sledge runners were built from bone, hide, or whatever driftwood arrived on a current from somewhere else. Clothing came from caribou and seal. Light and heat came from rendered blubber burning in a carved stone lamp. Every category of material other societies took for granted either did not exist there or existed in quantities so small that its absence shaped daily life around it. In an environment like that, a metal blade is not a convenience. It is the difference between a harpoon that penetrates and one that does not, between a carcass processed before the weather turns and one abandoned. Iron there is not decoration. It is hunting technology, and hunting is the entire margin between one winter and the next, which is why its presence there is so difficult to write off as incidental. European accounts of contact with them go back to the early 1800s, and almost from the beginning they include the same puzzled observation. These people had iron, not in abundance, not in every household, but consistently across generations, in small blades set into bone and ivory handles, and in harpoon tips shaped for hunting sea mammals at close range. The explanations offered at the time were reasonable, and all of them ran into the same wall. The first was shipwreck. Vessels had certainly been lost in Arctic waters, and salvaged metal did circulate among northern communities, but wreck iron leaves a signature. It arrives as nails, barrel hoops, fittings with recognizable manufactured shapes, and it arrives in bursts, tied to a specific event and a specific year. The iron on that coast did not behave that way. It was present before the wrecks that were supposed to explain it, and long after. The second was trade, metal moving north along Inuit networks from communities with more contact further south. This was real, and accounted for some of what was found, but not for the quantity, or the timing. Communities in a position to trade metal north would have to have been receiving it themselves first, and the record does not show that happening early enough or in sufficient volume. The third explanation was that the observers were simply mistaken about how much iron there was. They were not. And this is where the story stops being a curiosity and becomes a problem with numbers in it. When later researchers catalogued the tools collected across the 19th century, and archaeologists added what came out of the ground in the 20th, a rough accounting became possible. The quantity of worked metal that passed through that region is substantial, and it appears in tools from settlement sites across an enormous area of the Arctic, some separated from that Greenland coastline by hundreds of miles of ice and open water. That is the part that still has no clean answer. Not simply where the metal came from, but how far it travelled, through whose hands, and in exchange for what. A network moving worked metal that distance, across that terrain, without written records and without the infrastructure that usually leaves traces, is something the archaeological record is still working out how to describe. But before any of that could be asked, someone had to find the source. That took most of a century, and it did not fail for lack of asking. The location was not a secret. Accounts from multiple expeditions across the 1800s record the same exchange. The question is asked, the answer is given, and the answer is a place name. No evasion, no refusal, no sense that anyone was guarding anything. It was offered the way any ordinary geographic fact is offered. The problem was that it converted into nothing an outsider could use. A place name on that coast is not a coordinate. It sits inside a system of knowledge built around routes, seasons, ice conditions, and landmarks that only become meaningful if you already know the surrounding landscape well enough to recognize them. Told from the outside, it produced a direction and very little else. There is a further problem, and it is physical. The interior of that coastline does not reward searching. It is low, broken ground under snow for most of the year, without the features a stranger can navigate by. A ridge is a ridge, a rise is a rise. The light in the high Arctic flattens distance and strips away the cues an eye trained elsewhere relies on, and what the snow covers, it covers completely. An object weighing 30 tons is, in that setting, invisible unless you are standing on it. So expeditions searched and failed. The site sat, decade after decade, roughly 35 miles from the nearest settlement, in ground people walked past on their way elsewhere, entirely known to one group of human beings and entirely unreachable by another. That gap between knowing and finding is one of the quiet, unresolved questions inside this story. The information was never hidden. It was simply not transferable. And the years it took to close that gap say something uncomfortable about how much of the record consists of things nobody wrote down because nobody was ever asked in a way that worked. It finally closed in 1894. An American expedition led by Robert Peary, which had already spent time in the region and built working relationships with Inughuit hunters, was guided overland to the location by a man named Tallakoteah. Peary later published his own account of the journey, and it is that account, along with the material evidence that followed, that turned a century of second-hand reports into a documented finding. The difference between 1894 and the 100 years that failed before it is not a difference of effort or equipment. The earlier attempts had ships, instruments, funding, and men who considered themselves competent surveyors. What they lacked was a guide who already knew the ground. What worked was not a better search. It was a person walking ahead of them, on a route he had been told about long before any of them arrived, stopping when he got there. At the end of it, the party arrived at a place that by every visual standard an outsider would apply, looked like nothing. What Tallakoteah led them to was not a mine, not a vein, not a seam, not an exposure of ore in a rock face. There was nothing there to smelt. There were masses of solid metal sitting in and on the ground. 3 were located in that initial period, and they were known by names that described them: the tent, the woman, and the dog. The tent is enormous, weighing in excess of 30 tons. Standing beside it, a person does not reach the top. The woman and the dog are smaller, but still far beyond anything that could be moved by hand. They are meteorites, fragments of a single iron body that entered the atmosphere and broke apart over that coastline, so far back that no oral tradition and no written record reaches it. Iron and nickel in metallic form, requiring no smelting because the smelting had already happened, in a way, out in space, long before the Earth had anything on it capable of noticing. And around those masses, across the surrounding ground, the evidence of what had been done with them. Thousands of stones, hard, rounded, hand-sized, carried in from elsewhere, because the local rock is not hard enough to do the job. They were used as hammers, struck against the metal to break away fragments, over and over, across a span of time long enough that the ground around the masses is layered with them. The surfaces of the meteorites themselves are pitted and hollowed where the work was done. That scatter of stone carries more information than it first appears to. Each stone had to be selected. Not any rock will do the work, and the ones that will are not lying at the site, which means every one represents a weight carried across distance to a place where it would be used and left. They are imported tools, brought to a workshop with no raw material of its own except the thing being worked. They also broke. Striking iron with stone destroys the stone long before it damages the iron, which is why they are there in such quantity. The accumulation is not a single event. It is the residue of an enormous number of strikes, across an enormous number of visits, by people who knew before setting out that most of what they carried in would be worn through by the time they left. The pitting on the masses records the same thing from the other side. Every fragment was worked loose slowly, by hand, in cold that would have made holding a stone hammer an endurance problem in its own right. This is what the physical evidence says, plainly and without ambiguity. Someone came here, repeatedly, deliberately, over generations, carrying tools chosen for the task, and removed metal from an object that had fallen out of the sky. That changes the shape of the question considerably, because cold-working meteoric iron is not simple. Its nickel content makes it harder and less forgiving than terrestrial iron, and its crystalline structure responds badly to careless handling. Working it without heat means striking it in a controlled way, then annealing it, then working it again, in a cycle that has to be understood before it can be performed. Get it wrong and the metal cracks and the piece is wasted. Get it right and you have a blade that holds an edge through a season of hunting. Nobody stumbles into that process. It is learned, refined and passed on, which raises a question the physical record cannot answer alone. How does a technique that specific survive across generations in a population with no writing, in an environment where a single hard winter can end a family line? And how does the knowledge of a location 35 miles inland in featureless terrain survive alongside it, accurately enough that the route could still be walked in 1894? For that half of the story, the geology and the hammerstones have nothing to offer. The answer, such as it is, comes from the Inuit themselves. The oral tradition around the site was recorded by several visitors in the late 19th and early 20th centuries, and it is treated here as what it is, a historical source with the same standing as a survey report and the same obligation to be weighed carefully. According to those accounts, the masses were understood neither as ore nor as rock, but as something that had come down. The names given to them describe their shapes, and the tradition holds that they were once beings, brought to rest on that ground and remaining there. Whether that framing shaped how the metal was approached is not something any outside record can confirm, but the fact the tradition encodes is verifiably correct. The metal did come from the sky. It is not from that ground. It is not from that planet. A population with no metallurgy, no instrumentation, and no theoretical framework for what a meteorite is had correctly identified the origin of the only metal source on their coastline and built practical knowledge around it precise enough to locate it, work it, and keep doing both for generations. And there is a further detail in the accounts that matters. The knowledge of where to go was not, according to the tradition, rediscovered by each generation. It was carried deliberately, taught as part of what a person needed to know, alongside the routes and the seasons and the ice. Modern analysis has been able to check part of this against the ground. Metal from that source has been chemically identified in tools recovered from sites far outside the immediate region, across a large portion of the Arctic. It is identifiable because meteoritic iron carries a nickel signature terrestrial iron does not, a fingerprint that survives hammering, shaping, use, burial, and centuries in frozen soil. So tradition and archaeology arrive at the same place from opposite directions. The oral record describes a source and a practice of carrying knowledge outward. The chemistry shows the metal itself moving outward, hundreds of miles into communities that never saw the masses it came from. How that movement worked is still open. Who carried it? How often? Along which routes? What came back the other way? The metal is the only part of the transaction that survived, and a fragment of iron in a bone handle does not record who traded it or what it cost. There is one more thing the numbers do not fully settle. 3 masses were located in 1894, and a 4th in the region decades later, but falls of that kind scatter, and what was recovered is not necessarily all of what came down. How much material was originally available, how much was worked away across centuries of use, and whether other fragments were exhausted or still lie under the ground are questions the current accounting cannot close. The catalogue is what has been found. It is not necessarily what was there, so consider what this story contains. A population in one of the most resource-poor environments on Earth, holding a metal technology the surrounding geology cannot explain. A century of outside investigation that failed to find the source, not because the information was withheld, but because it was offered in a form outsiders could not use. An oral tradition that correctly identified that metal as extraterrestrial, without any of the tools that conclusion is supposed to require, and a distribution of it across the Arctic implying a network nobody has fully mapped. None of that is fringe history. All of it is documented, and most of it is measurable. What the record does not contain is an ending. In 1894 the site was reached, and over the following 3 years the masses were removed. The smaller 2 came first. The tent was another matter. Moving something that heavy across broken ground, in a place with no roads and no harbour, is not a matter of lifting it. Track had to be laid. Winches had to be anchored against ground that offered little to anchor to. And the work depended on a narrow seasonal window when the sea was open enough for a ship to reach the coast at all, which meant it could not be finished in one effort. It took until 1897. They were taken to New York. The removal was recorded as a scientific achievement, and in the terms of its time it was one. What was recorded far less carefully was the other half of the transaction. The metal that had supplied that coastline for generations left it. The knowledge remained, the route remained, the tradition remained, and the thing they pointed to was gone. There is no dramatic ending to that. No confrontation, no disaster. A technology that had lasted centuries stopped, not because the people practicing it forgot how, but because the material it depended on had been put on a ship. Some interpretations of this history remain genuinely debated, and what the exchange involved and what was understood on either side of it are things researchers continue to examine. What is not debated is the sequence. The masses were there, they were used, they were removed. History does not usually hand us a case this clean and still leave this much of it unanswered. The source is identified, the chemistry is confirmed, the technique is understood, and the oral tradition turned out to be correct in the one detail that should have been impossible for it to know. And yet the accounting of how much metal there was, the map of how far it travelled, and the mechanics of how the knowledge survived long enough to be walked on in 1894 all remain incomplete. For a very long time, a hard object sat in a soft landscape, and the only people who knew where it was could not say so in a language anyone else would accept as an answer. They were right the whole time. It took 100 years and a guide named Tallakoteah for that to count as a finding. Thank you for watching. If documentaries built on physical evidence and indigenous oral tradition held to the same standard are the kind of history you want more of, consider subscribing. And before you go, I want to ask you directly, if a people with no writing and no instruments correctly identified where that metal came from, and outsiders spent a century unable to find something they were being told about openly, how much else do you think the record has missed simply because nobody knew how to hear the answer? I'll see you in the next documentary.